folks, Nick Donatil here, and welcome back to the Houdini for MoGraph series. I'm sure most of you have seen Marvel's Doctor Strange movie, and today we're going to be covering how to do the magical sparks rope that he uses in the film. Now we're going to go through and do just a simplified version of this, but you could easily take this base and just keep adding more detail to get something closer to what they actually did. So let's just get into it. This effect is essentially three simulations. It's a rope, then the particles that go along the rope, and the sparks that are coming off of it. So we're going to start with the rope for the base. So make a line with a direction of just 1 in the Z and a length of 10 with 50 points. Now we want a point that remains stable as this moves around. So I'm going to make a group, set it to points, and name it pin, and just put the 0 point in that group. Next, let's just give it some animation. So I'm going to make a transform node, and in the translate x, I'm going to do sine parentheses $f times 14, close those parentheses. And now I'm just going to copy that and paste it into the y, just changing the 14 to a 6 so that it goes at different frequencies. And then in the z, I'm also going to paste it, but I'm just going to change the sine to cosine, so that way it just kind of goes in a round circle on that plane. So next, for the sim, we're going to make a vellum hair node, put our pin group in the pin points, and check on match animation. That way the base moves how it is before the sim. Next, make a vellum solver, making sure all three things are hooked up. And if you hit play, then you can see that you have a rope sim. So to just prep this for our particles, I'm going to drop a smooth just to kind of hit that edge off the beginning. And then I'm going to do an attribute delete, typing asterisk, then a caret V to say delete everything except for velocity. And then do a polyframe node. And if you turn on the normal guides, you can see that I'm going to uncheck this normal. And on this tangent, I'm going to change that to N capital to make sure that the normals are moving along the spline, which is something we're going to use in one of the other sims in just a few minutes. And that's our base. So now onto the particles moving along the line. So you could simulate this pushing the particles towards the closest point. But when you have a lot of motion happening, I found that it's a lot easier to actually simulate this on a line and then just deform it along the curve later. So before the animation on the line, I'm going to make a blast node, setting it to a pin, and delete non-selected, which will just give us that first point in the line. And then make a sphere and copy to points. I'm going to change the sphere to 0.02. And this is our emitter. So I'm just going to make a pop net. And before I dive inside, I'm going to increase these sub steps to 3. What this does is it calculates the values in between frames. So it'll actually do 3 calculations per frame now instead of 1. This is helpful when you have just fast moving objects for more accurate simulation. Now I'm going to dive inside, and I'm going to first change our source to 2000 and our life of the particles to 2. Now in the attributes, I'm going to set it to add to inherited velocity, setting it to 10 in the Z to follow along our line. And they just fly out really quickly, so I'm going to make a pop wind, which will give it some drag, changing the air resistance to just 0.1. And I'm going to bring the amplitude of this noise up to 10 and maybe tweak a few of the other settings just to give it some random noise. And now it's obviously just way too wild getting out there. So we're going to try to set up something to push it back in towards that main line. So make a pop vop, and inside multiply the position by a constant. And I'm going to set the constant to 3 floats. And it's just going to be 0, 0, and 1. And then do a subtract from that and hook up the original position. And what this is doing, it's just saying take the z position on the 0, 0 axis and point towards that. Next, I'm going to do a multiply and just promote that so we could adjust as needed. And then I'm going to add this to the velocity and bind it out to velocity. So hop up, and I'm actually going to change that multiply to 10. That's something I just found in setting this scene up, but feel free to play around with that to see what the different looks you can get are. And you can see that we have a string. Now it's also going way further than our actual rope though, so I'm going to make another point pop and do a vector to float on the position and fit the z from 0 to 10 and just reverse it so it's 1 to 0. And I'm going to bind that out to color and blast node and typing at cd equals 0 and changing the type to points so that we cut off at 10. In my scene, which you could download off of the site, I actually went through and did a little more variation just so that it wasn't such a harsh line, but I think that's something you guys could probably figure out on your own by now. So now let's just deform this so that it moves with that rope sim. We'll use a wire capture node hooking the second to the static line to tell it which points to grab, and then we're going to do a wire deform, also hooking the second input up there, but then we're going to hook this third one to the end of our wire sim. And now you can see that we have some motion, but it's not exact. So the only thing I want to adjust is in the wire capture. I'm going to bring up that min, max, and the U radius until it looks right and looks like it's deforming properly. And that's our particles moving along the wire. Now to make it look more like sparks, we're going to make a line and copy it to points, changing the direction to 1 and the z again. And just adjust the length to make it shorter. Now do an attribute transfer from the polyframe, setting it to n, so that we have them facing along the line as opposed to just facing outwards. And now last, we just want to make an attribute random, setting it to p scale in 1 dimension. This is just to give it some variation. And now on to our secondary sparks. Off the wire, I'm going to make a blast and set it to points, typing at v equals 0 to kill those static points in the first few frames, and then just make a pop net, hit play, and you can see we already have some cool stuff happening since the particles are inheriting the velocity from the rope. I'm just going to bring the amount down to 2000. The life of 0.8 with a variation of 0.5. And in attributes, I'm going to do add to inherited and give them a variance of just 1.5 in the velocity. And hit play, and yep, that's looking cool. And last, I'm just going to make a pop wind for some air drag, giving it a bit of noise in the amplitude for some variance. And that's it. It's way simpler for our secondary sim here. So we're going to hop back out and we're going to merge this with our first sim before the lines are copied. And you see that the secondary ones appear to be missing. That's because the first ones have a p-scale attribute and the second one doesn't, so that it's defaulting to 0 and making them look invisible. So we're going to make a point vop, and we want it to scale down over time. So we're going to do an age divided by life, and we're doing this instead of just doing an age with a fit because each of the particles has a different life since we gave it variance. And now we're going to fit that from 0 to 1 to 1 to 0 just to reverse it, and bind export that to p-scale. And while we're here, we're going to also hook it up to CD for color, which we'll use in a second. So currently you see that these particles move along the arc because they are storing the normals from the wire, but we want them to face the direction they're going. So make another point fob, and then take the velocity, normalize it, which basically just takes the direction of the velocity and fits it between -1 and 1, and bind that out to normal. And now just a few more things that we're going to do to tweak the look. So to visualize these, we're going to drop a poly wire and type at p-scale into the radius. And now let's actually set up a p-scale. So I'm going to make a point fob. And we have the color over age. And also we have the color going along the line. So let's use that, doing a vector to float on the color. Then a multiply constant set to 0.01. And then bind export that to p-scale. And now you see our points. And for some variation, I'm just going to do a random on the ID and multiply all of this by that. And there you have it. Some nice sparks coming off of a magical rope. To see some of the extra detail that I added into the simulation files, as well as how I did the render, how I set up the material. Ultimately, this is being rendered as lines and actually not using the polywire. You can download the project files off of the link to the site below. As always, would love to hear from you in the comments if there's any effects you'd like to see tutorials for in the future. Hope you enjoyed this one, and until next time.